President Truman strongly supported civil rights. One of his first actions was desegregating the U.S. Armed Forces. He was extremely outraged by murders and assaults of dozens of African American World War II veterans. He also knew that civil rights was the right thing to do and that he needed the African American vote to be elected. President Eisenhower, on the other hand, had an opposite view towards civil rights. He disliked and refused to endorse the ruling of the Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka ruling. While he disliked their ruling, he still had to uphold it, and did so when resistance towards desegregation began. However, when schools began shutting down to prevent integration, Eisenhower took no action. He did, however, sign the first legislation for civil rights since Reconstruction, which federally protected voting rights. Overall, Eisenhower was a tepid supporter for civil rights, as he urged supporters to move slowly. Most of the methods of protest were acts of nonviolence and civil disobedience, such as boycotts and speeches. Martin Luther King Jr. was a large contributor and leader in the nonviolent protests for civil rights. The Montgomery bus boycott was a boycott of buses to protest racial segregation on public transportation. Rosa Parks began the boycott and was amplified by King. King also led a march on Washington for jobs and freedom, where he gave his famous I Have a Dream speech to a crowd of over 200,000 people. The Albany movement was a coalition to protest city segregation policies. The Birmingham Campaign was a strategic effort led by King to end discriminatory economic policies in Birmingham, Alabama. Some of it involved the boycotting of businesses that only hired Caucasian people for jobs. Bloody Sunday was a march from Selma, Alabama to Montgomery, led by Martin Luther King Jr. that included over 600 protesters. Police violence created its infamous name, and when broadcasted around the nation, it created widespread outrage and support for civil rights. The 14th Amendment was a strong step forward in equal rights. It gave anyone born in the U.S. or naturalized by the U.S. the ability to become citizens. It also said no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of the law. A person can't hold a job in Congress, the presidency, or any office, civil or military, if they've previously taken an oath as a member of office. However, a two-thirds vote from Congress can waive this disability. The validity of public debt of the U.S. shall not be questioned.
Martin Luther King Jr. was a huge advocate in the fight for civil rights. He led the African American movement to achieve full citizenship and persuaded the majority of African Americans to take him as their leader. He also received a sociology degree from Morehouse College, and previously he had been ordained a Baptist minister and was an assistant pastor to his father. Martin Luther King Jr. led a pilgrimage of 25,000 people in Washington, D.C., demanding federal action on civil rights. In June 1958, he met with President Dwight D. Eisenhower to urge stronger federal protection of civil rights. King supported Gandhian techniques of civil disobedience, including the boycott, sit-in, the protest march, and freedom rides. His most strenuous and courageous action was the struggle to integrate Birmingham, Alabama during the spring of 1963. King began organizing protests and the picketing of city businesses. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference produced a list of demands that, if followed, would bring about desegregation. King was then arrested and sent to jail. Civic leaders called King a troublemaker and urged him to stop demonstrating against segregation. Instead, they said King should be more patient and wait for change. While in his jail cell, King wrote a letter in response to this argument. The document was called Letter from a Birmingham Jail. He explains that for years he has always heard the word wait, and it really means never. King says that for more than 340 years, they have waited for their constitutional and God-given rights. Martin Luther King Jr.'s revolutionary actions helped reshape America's society, and his ideals are still present today. Malcolm X was accused of burglary at the age of 20 and was sentenced to 10 years in prison. While in prison, he began to read about history, philosophy, and religion. Through his brother, he learned about the Nation of Islam, led by Muhammad. When he was released from prison, he immediately began rising in ranks, becoming persuasive, and recruiting blacks through his speaking abilities. Then a Muslim newspaper was started, and it recruited thousands of blacks. The Muslim movement was effective in organizing schools and businesses, but it also frightened whites. The Muslims were anti-integration and thought nonviolence was absurd. They would not cooperate in demonstrations with the NAACP. Malcolm X conflicted with Muhammad and other Islamic leaders. They said Malcolm X had forgot the original religious intentions of Muslims and that he was being swayed by politics. When Malcolm became suspicious of Muhammad's lifestyle and morals, he broke away and formed his own group called the Muslim Mosque. Malcolm X went on a pilgrimage to Mecca and visited African countries. He discovered that many Muslims' views differed from his, so he seriously considered his position. When he returned to America, he announced that he changed his belief that all whites were evil and racist. He now believed that the unfortunate events that African Americans were experiencing were caused by Western civilization. Malcolm then formed the Organization of Afro-American Unity to bring together black groups that he had previously conflicted with. This action actually offended more militant Muslims. On February 21, 1965, while speaking at a rally in Harlem, Malcolm was assassinated. Malcolm X helped shape the movement for Black Power that challenged the nonviolent and integrationalist struggle for African American equality that was favored by Martin Luther King Jr. His words and actions helped fuel the integration of blacks and whites.
In the mid-1890s, Homer Plessy violated a major separate car act in Louisiana, which segregated railway cars on the basis for race. This is what all started the Plessy versus Ferguson case in 1896. The decision that was made in the Plessy versus Ferguson case made it legal for facilities to separate blacks from whites. This was considered constitutionally legal at the time. In 1954, the Brown versus Board of Education case hit the Supreme Court. The NAACP is the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, and it was led by attorney Thurgood Marshall. Thurgood Marshall was fighting for rights against segregation. Recently, just before this case hit the Supreme Court, the case was in South Carolina, and the case was called Harry Briggs Jr. versus Clarendon County Schools. This case was all started because a young black boy had to walk 5 miles to school every day. In this small town in South Carolina, white children were given more tax money than black children, which means that they were given more money towards their education. Thurgood Marshall was trying to overcome the fact of separate but equal, which was decided in the Plessy versus Ferguson case in 1896. Thurgood Marshall's main point in the Brown versus Board of Education case was to try and end segregation in all schools. He believed that segregation in public schools hurt African American children and influenced their thoughts about race. After a long battle in court, Thurgood Marshall finally overcame his goal of ending segregation in public schools. Jim Crow laws were racial segregation laws that were enacted in 1876. Some prime examples of Jim Crow laws is the segregation in public schools, public transportation, and public places. Along with all public places being segregated, the U.S. military was also. Some southern states enacted the grandfather law, which allows you the right to vote only if your grandfather had the right to vote. This was a direct shot at the African American population whose ancestors were slaves.
Today in the modern world, we see many violations of civil rights. In many instances, we see violations against homosexuals. These violations can include execution by the state, denial of employment, housing, or health services, loss of custody of children, denial of asylum, rape and otherwise torture and detention, threats for campaigning for LGBT human rights, and we also see subjection to verbal abuse. Article 16 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights says that men and women of full age without any limitation due to race, nationality, or religion have the right to marry and to found a family. They are entitled to equal rights as to marriage, during marriage, and its dissolution.
They released a statement that said, quote, gay marriage advocates have attempted to portray same-sex marriage as a civil right. Gay marriage is not a civil right. You see the push for equal rights for gay and lesbian Americans as a civil rights movement.
Very much so.
As an extension of the civil rights movement.
It is exactly the same, and it's a right that all Americans have, and no reason why gay and lesbian people ought not to have these rights too. These are universal rights.
But to those who say, look, this has nothing to do with civil rights, and there are many African Americans who actually get offended by the comparison to the civil rights movement among African Americans.
We ought to be happy that other people, including gays and lesbians and many other people, have imitated the black movement for human rights. They've adopted our songs, we ought to be happy. They've adopted our slogans, we ought to be happy. They've adopted the way in which we went about it in a nonviolent way, generally speaking. We ought to be proud of that we served as an example to others. And when others imitate what we did to gain their rights, we ought to be first in line to say, can I help you? You help me, can I help you?